All right, well, good morning again to you, and as mentioned, we're in my shop this morning. I'll be teaching from here this week and next week due to a COVID exposure. We've decided to self-quarantine just in case. So we'll be here and you get to enjoy a different background for this morning. So we're going to be in Matthew chapter 24, and looking at the Olivet Discourse. Now this cross-references in Mark chapter 13 as well as Luke 21. And all three are considered. I'm primarily looking at verses in Matthew, but all three of them record the same event. There is a little bit of a difference in Luke. There's a little bit of a difference on the emphasis there. And he records some details that we don't see in Matthew and Mark. But it is a great prophetic chapter or section of Scripture, and important for us to understand when it comes to Bible prophecy. Now, as we look at the events of recent history, and we look at things that are happening in this country as well as around the world, we wonder if we're seeing the beginnings of the end times. And naturally, we ask the question, when is Jesus going to come back? And are we going to be raptured before it gets too bad? What is the church going to do? I've heard some people liken it to a family being crammed into a minivan and out on a road trip. And the question comes up over and over again, are we there yet? Are we there yet? And I'm sure many of you have experienced that with your own kids. And how much longer are we going to have to drive and all that sort of thing. So that's the same type of question that we have as believers when it comes to the end times. And of course, I don't know about you, but I'm ready for the Lord to return right now. All the stuff that's going on, I'd be happy to escape this crazy world. But there are things that happen that grieve us deeply, and we wonder what's in store as believers. And Matthew chapter 24 and 25 form what is known as the Olivet Discourse. And it's named that because this important pronouncement was given on the Mount of Olives. And the Olivet Discourse is made up of the Lord's teaching on Bible prophecy. And it's really the primary teaching that Jesus himself gave with regard to prophecy. And it's found in Matthew 24 and 25, as well as Mark chapter 13 and Luke chapter 21. Now, since one's interpretation of the Olivet Discourse greatly impacts their prophetic understanding and sort of helps determine if they're a premillennialist or anti-millennialist or futurist or preterist or pre-tribulationist, all of those things, it's important for us to understand the passage in detail. And of course, those are all different theological terms that describe where you view the rapture occurring, whether at the beginning, middle, or end of the tribulation, and then the second coming in relation to the millennium as well. And so, it's important for us to understand this passage in detail. And I could probably spend a few weeks covering this because there's that much detail in it, but we're just going to do sort of a high-level overview this morning and focus especially on a particular question of whether this relates to the rapture or the second coming. Now, this discourse is primarily prophetic. It points forward to the tribulation period, it points forward to the second coming of Christ, and it primarily concerns the nation of Israel. It's located, obviously, in the nation of Israel in what is, modern-day Jerusalem. And in here, Jesus says, "Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." And the setting is also distinctly Jewish. Again, Jesus says, "Pray that your flight may not be on the Sabbath." And then the references to the elect, as we'll see, should be understood as the Jewish elect and not the church. And that is true in this section as well as the parables. There are a number of parables within this discourse. So we're going to just take a few minutes and examine the Olivet Discourse this morning. So first of all is the introduction to it and the historical context. So as we mentioned previously, anytime you look at Bible prophecy and really anything in Scripture, you need to look at the context and pay attention to the context. What is the passage saying? What is immediately before and after the passage? And what is the general context of that passage in relation to the book where you find it, as well as the Bible as a whole. We have to consider the Bible as a whole. And the book of Matthew is a book that was written primarily to Jews and presents Jesus as the King of the Jews. You know, each of the Gospels has a different emphasis. And Matthew presents Jesus as the King of the Jews and is written primarily to the Jews. Mark presents Jesus as the suffering servant and is primarily written to Gentiles as well. And so it's important to consider the overall context. And the events that we see here, the chapters that precede Matthew 24, are important to consider as well. So we see just a few chapters earlier that Jesus had presented himself to the nation as their Messiah. He had come in and presented himself on Palm Sunday and had arrived on a donkey and fulfilled the prophecies that were related to the Messiah there. And then he began teaching in the temple and teaching people in the crowds there. And in that teaching, and we have a lot of that recorded, we see that there was some confrontations with the Jewish leaders. And in those confrontations, we see that the Jewish leaders rejected Jesus as the Messiah. And they began planning how they could get rid of him and to get him out of the picture. And so Jesus then rebuked and exposed their hypocrisy and their unbelief. And that's mentioned in Matthew chapter 22 and 23, some of those events and the challenges that came and the responses that Jesus had. Jesus points out that the Jewish leaders were like those of the previous generation who had killed the prophets. And even though the prophets had come and given God's message, historically the Jewish people had killed those prophets. And Jesus pointed out that the Pharisees were doing much the same thing, or they had the same type of attitude as the Old Testament. And so Jesus rebukes them. And then Jesus mentioned the judgment that was going to be coming upon them and determined and pointed that out, that they were in danger of judgment. And then we see in Matthew 23 a lament over Jerusalem. If you look at the end of Matthew 23, verses 37 through 39, Jesus says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And so, as Jesus was teaching, this was one of the last things that he said to the people and to the Jewish leaders, was this lament. But there's also a mention of judgment within that. So, we see that lament here. Now, even though the Jewish people, even though they deserved the judgment that was approaching, just like a caring parent who's about to administer discipline, Jesus cried out in a lament and explained his love and care for the Jewish people, and that even though they deserved the punishment, it didn't necessarily bring him pleasure to bring that punishment upon them. He wanted to just gather his people and love on them. But instead, they would end up being scattered via a judgment that would come upon them in 70 AD. And so, he says in verse 38 there, "Behold, your house is being left to you desolate." And in the context of this passage, that is referring to the Jewish temple. because that was the center of their worship, and that was the place where the Jewish leaders would go, and they had all these different laws and everything that they had made, and it was all part of their religious system. And so then we see in chapter 24, verse 1, Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down." And as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming, and of the end of the age?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See to it that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations. Then the end will come." And then he goes on to describe the perilous times in verse 15. He says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever's on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are out of his house. Whoever's in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, 'Behold, here is the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, 'Behold, he is in the wilderness,' do not go out. Or 'Behold, he is in the inner rooms,' do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds in the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other." And so that's the first part that Jesus gives. And then he goes on into a couple of parables. And so he declared this judgment at the end of Matthew 23. And then we see this discussion that comes. It's brought up by the disciples. And they began asking about, talking about the temple, and Jesus foretells its destruction. And that carries on with what he'd mentioned right at the end of chapter 23. So that's the context of the passage as we see. And then the historical setting we have to consider as well. Anytime you look at any passage of Scripture, you need to consider the historical setting of that passage. So in this case, Jesus was making his way from the temple to the Mount of Olives. So he'd been in the temple preaching, teaching, and it was getting ready for Passover week, and so they were preparing for all of that. And so Jesus had been in the temple with his disciples, and now they were making their way from the temple to the Mount of Olives. So most likely he would be going down the Kidron Valley, from the Temple Mount down the Kidron Valley, and then back up the Mount of Olives. And when you're on the Mount of Olives, you can look over the Temple Mount area. And it's a beautiful sight. I was there in college. And you can see a great portion of the city there from the Mount of Olives. And so that's where Jesus and the disciples were. And the disciples came up, a few of them came up and began asking Jesus privately about the prophecy he'd given about the temple. And so they were talking about this beautiful temple complex. Now, King Herod had greatly renovated the temple. This was the temple that was built by Zerubbabel when they were returning from the Babylonian captivity. And then when Herod came on the throne, he expanded the temple and made it almost as beautiful as Solomon's temple had been, and wanted to restore sort of the glory of the temple. And this work had started in 19 BC, after Herod had been on the throne for a little while. And Herod was a great builder, and so this was another one of his projects. And so he had started this process of remodeling and refurbishing not only the temple itself, but the entire Temple Mount, and actually doubled the size of the Temple Mount and built some other fortresses and a lot of different things. And so you can see a picture here. This is a recreation of what they think that was like. And it's described by Josephus and by other historians as an absolutely magnificent building. There was white marble, and of course there was gold accents and highlights. And so in the sunlight, that white marble shone like a beacon, especially at sunset or something. And so it was an absolutely beautiful temple complex. And work was actually still ongoing at this time. Now most of it had been done. The temple itself had been completed, but the Temple Mount was still in construction in the time that Jesus and the disciples were there. But anyway, as they're coming down from leaving the temple and going across over to the Mount of Olives, the disciples are commenting about how beautiful the temple is. Of course, being Jews, they were proud of their beautiful temple. And so they were talking about this, the parallel references in Mark and Luke give us a little more detail that they were talking about the temple buildings. And so when they made this comment, Jesus said in verse 2, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down." So when they were talking about this, Jesus mentioned that it was going to be destroyed. And so later when they were on the Mount of Olives, all the disciples came up and they're like, "Well, what do you mean this is going to be destroyed?" And they had questions. And so that is the disciples' private discussion that they had with Jesus. So Mark and Luke record that it was actually Peter, James, John, and Andrew that came and were talking to Jesus about this. And so they began asking Jesus about his statement that he'd made about the temple being destroyed. And this is a pattern that Jesus followed, where he would teach only his believing disciples once the nation rejected him as their prophesied Messiah. And from Matthew chapter 13 and on, Jesus spoke publicly to the nation in parables, but many times he would explain those parables privately to his disciples. And so this is another instance where Jesus was giving them a private explanation of something that he'd said and answering some of the questions that they had. But it was given for the benefit of all future believers as well, so that we can see these discussions that Jesus had. So it's this private discussion that Jesus was having. Now, there is a Jewish emphasis in this discourse, this Olivet discourse. So remember, this is the Jewish Messiah who is answering questions by Jewish disciples about the end of the age. Now, over 500 years before, the angel Gabriel had given Daniel this vision, or explained this vision of the 70 weeks, and we talked about that last week. The Daniel 70 weeks and how that gives an outline of Bible prophecy. And I mentioned last week that if they were really paying attention, they would have known exactly when the Messiah was going to come, and that it figured to the day of of Jesus presenting himself on Palm Sunday. And so there was an expectation, a messianic expectation at this time. The Jews did expect that Messiah was going to come. They just didn't understand that he was going to be the suffering servant that Isaiah talks about in chapter 53. They were expecting a Messiah who was going to come and overthrow the Roman forces that occupied Jerusalem and Israel, and would set up his kingdom. And so there was a messianic expectation, but it wasn't quite what they were looking for. But again, the Jewish disciples are asking questions of the Jewish Messiah about the end of the age. And so as we saw last week, 483 of those years, or 69 weeks, had already passed by this time and had been completed. And there was only 1 week left in order to fulfill Daniel's prophecy. And so you can imagine their astonishment when they realize they're coming so close to the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy and understanding they're coming close to the time of the kingdom. And just when the end is in sight, and the temple and the surrounding buildings would all be destroyed. And so naturally that didn't make sense to them, because they were expecting the Messiah to come and set up a kingdom and to be able to fulfill all of these things. The temple was essential for worship. By this point, it had been under construction for about 46 years, that Temple Mount, and it was an ongoing project. And so since it had been so long in construction, how could it be torn down so completely and then rebuilt again within just 7 years? Because there was just 7 years left of Daniel's time. And so this led to their questions. They didn't understand anything about a church age. Jesus had mentioned the church just a couple of times, but had not given a lot of detail about the church. And so they had no idea that there was going to be a 2,000-year gap in the middle of Daniel's 70-week prophecy. And so we see that even after the resurrection, in John 20 and verse 22, even after the resurrection, after they had received the Holy Spirit, when Jesus was preparing to ascend back to the Father, what was one of the last questions that the disciples asked of Jesus? Well, they asked him, Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? So again, they still had that mindset of the kingdom, that Jewish mindset of what was going to happen with God's chosen people. And so this is a Jewish context in the questions as well. Then there's again, it's talking about the Jewish temple. This whole discussion had been prompted by a discussion about the temple. Remember, they were coming from the temple to the Mount of Olives and commenting about how beautiful the complex was. And Jesus, looking at the temple, says, well, that's going to be completely destroyed, and not one stone is going to be left upon another. And so that prompted their questions later once they reached the Mount of Olives. And so the focus there is the Jewish temple. And then we see mention of a number of Jewish events. So Jesus mentions the abomination of desolation. Now this was prophesied by Daniel, again, about the Jewish temple, and Jesus references it here in the Olivet Discourse. Then he also mentions the Sabbath. He tells them to pray that their flight would not take place on a Sabbath day, because there were restrictions, travel restrictions on the Sabbath. You could only walk a certain distance on the Sabbath, and you could only carry a certain amount of things and only do a certain number of things on a Sabbath day. And so that would make fleeing very difficult. And so Jesus mentions this fact. Now, that tells us that this is, again, a Jewish context, because Gentiles, they didn't care about the Sabbath. They had no interest in the Sabbath. That was a Jewish thing that was part of their religion. And so that tells us that when these events take place, and for them to pray that it won't happen on the Sabbath, that the only people that would really be relevant to are Jewish Old Covenant believers that are there in Judea. And so there's a Jewish emphasis there in the questions and the answers and the prophecies that Jesus gives. So then we see the disciples' misunderstanding, and we see their questions again in verse 3. They came up to him, and as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And so Jesus then is going to explain, but they were coming at this from a Jewish mindset. Now, the Jewish understanding of prophecy at this time is found in Zechariah and a few other passages. So they were asking, first of all, what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So in their minds, the chronology of events that they understood prophetically is a departure of the king, of the Messiah, and after a period of time there would be a destruction of Jerusalem, and then immediately after that devastation the Messiah would come and restore things and build his kingdom and establish his kingdom. And so that was their sort of mindset, and this understanding was based on Zechariah chapter 14 and some of the prophecies that are there, and it describes Jerusalem being destroyed and being raised and leveled. And then that same passage goes on to describe the coming of the Lord to destroy the nations which were warring against Jerusalem. And once that is done, then the millennial kingdom is established. Now we know, looking back, that that's a reference to the end of the tribulation period and the campaign of Armageddon, is what it's talking about. But in the Jewish mindset at the time, they were thinking of all of these events being one sort of event. All of them would occur around the coming of the Messiah. And so this destruction of Jerusalem and the restoration of the kingdom and all that, they thought of as a single sort of event. They didn't realize it was going to be separated by some time. And so even though the disciples merged these events in their minds and in their understanding, Jesus did not merge those into a single time period. Jesus did not combine them in a way that they, to indicate that they would happen all at the same time. Now Matthew and Mark, in their records of the Olivet Discourse, they don't deal with the destruction of Jerusalem itself. They record the prophecy that Jesus made, but there's not much mention made about the destruction of Jerusalem. Their focus is on the days of tribulation, which lead up to Christ's return. However, in Luke, we do have some details about the destruction of Jerusalem that's going to happen. If you look over in Luke chapter 21, so Luke chapter 21 and verses 20 through 24. And again, this is the recording of the Olivet Discourse according to Luke. And it starts in verse 5. And while some of them were talking about the temple that was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts, he said, "As for these things which you're looking at, the days will come when there will not be left one stone upon another, which will be torn down." And they questioned him, saying, "Teacher, when therefore will these things happen? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place?" And so again, this is the Olivet Discourse that Luke records. But down in verse 20, he says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city, because these are days of vengeance, so that all things which were written will be fulfilled. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." And so Luke records some more detail about when these things are going to happen. Although he did deal with the future days and the tribulation in the following verses, but he gives a little bit more information about the destruction of Jerusalem, which correlates with the prophecy in Zechariah. So their first question then, there's really two questions that they ask. And the first question is, tell us, when will these things happen? Now Jesus had previously prophesied that the temple was going to be destroyed. This is not the first time he mentioned it. In Matthew 23 and verse 38, we read a few minutes ago, in his lament, he mentions that destruction coming upon them. And then in Luke 19, at his triumphal entry, we see a record of this prophecy as well in Luke 19, 43 and 44. And so this was something that Jesus had mentioned a little bit earlier in the week, and the disciples had heard it then, and then just now as they're coming out of the temple, they heard him say it again, and so naturally they had questions. So the question of timing is answered only in Luke. Matthew and Mark don't record these details. But it was answered in Luke, and that was fulfilled by the Romans in 70 AD. And so we know that historically the Roman general Titus came in and they besieged Jerusalem and ultimately leveled the city and the temple as a punishment upon the Jewish revolt. And this was the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy that the temple was going to be destroyed. And so the entire passage, again, speaks over and over again of judgment and wrath upon the Jewish people and upon their city, just as Jesus had prophesied. And so we have this answer there in Luke of that first question. But the second question is really what most of this discourse deals with, is that second question, and that's talking about the tribulation and the abomination of desolation. And this is covered from verse 4 all the way up through verse 41 of Matthew 24. All of these things are relating to that tribulation period. Now, the first half of the tribulation is covered in verses 4 through 14. Now, I'm about to give you something that you probably haven't heard before. When you read these verses and when you hear people talk about these verses, the birth pangs, okay? In verses 4 and following, Jesus answered and said, "See to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You'll be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See to it that you're not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes, but all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs." So, what do most people talk about with that passage? What do most people say that passage is referring to?
That would be the one tribulation coming back. The coming tribulation is being prophesied here, I think.
Yeah, so times of tribulation and difficulty, but most commentators will talk about the signs of the times, right? You've heard the signs of the times, and how all of these things are going to be increased leading up to the tribulation period. But is that really what Jesus was talking about here? In fact, there's good evidence and understanding that these birth pangs actually correspond with the first 6 seal judgments at the beginning of the tribulation. And it's not talking about the time period leading up to the tribulation. It's not talking about the time we're in right now, with things getting worse and worse. Rather, it's talking about the situation during the tribulation period. So again, most people will say that these, the increase of lawlessness and the increase of false prophets and messiahs and all those things, most people will say that we're in seeing those signs of the times, and earthquakes and famines and all of that stuff. We're seeing those today. But in fact, if you look at the chart that is on your notes, you can see how these birth pangs actually correlate with the judgments in Revelation chapter 6. Now, we're going to be looking at the judgments in some more detail a little bit later. But during the tribulation, there's 3 such judgments that the Lord releases upon the world as his wrath. The seal judgments, and then there's the trumpets, and then the bowls. And so these seal judgments correlate with what Jesus mentions here in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. And on that chart you can see how all of those different verses correlate and how they match up with what Jesus is saying there. Now, a scholar by the name of J. Randall Price, he gives this explanation with regard to the birth pangs. He says, the birth pangs are significant in the timing of the tribulation as revealed by Jesus in the Olivet Discourse. Jesus' statement of the birth pangs is specifically that the events of the first half of the tribulation are merely the beginning, with the expectation of greater birth pangs in the second half, or the Great Tribulation. Based on this analogy, the entire period of the 70th week is like birth pangs. As a woman must endure the entire period of labor before giving birth, so Israel must endure the entire 7-year tribulation. The time divisions of tribulation are also illustrated by the figure, for just as the natural process intensifies toward delivery after labor ends, so here the tribulation moves progressively toward the second advent, which takes place immediately after the tribulation ends. As there are 2 phases of the birth pangs, beginning labor and full labor, so the 7 years of tribulation are divided between the less severe and more severe experiences of terrestrial and cosmic wrath, as revealed progressively in the Olivet Discourse and the judgment section of Revelation 6 through 19. So when you hear people talk about the signs of the times, often you'll hear prophecy scholars mention that we're seeing the signs of the times and the increase in earthquakes and all of that stuff. But in fact, all of those signs are not right now. Those are signs that are going to be happening during the first half of the tribulation, and those are the birth pangs that we're really talking about. Now certainly we're in a world where things are getting worse, and we see earthquakes and famines and all of that, but it's not really, it doesn't completely match up with the signs that Jesus mentions here. So generally, we do see that things are getting worse, but there's not much of a difference in the increase of those things, and it doesn't exactly match. So what Jesus is talking about here is really just the tribulation period. But Jesus gives them a warning not to be deceived. He mentions here, I didn't know what verse, but a couple of times Jesus mentions not to be deceived, and that's a reference to not being deceived by the false Antichrist, because again, these are the Jewish representatives that he's talking about. The disciples are representing the Jews, not the church, and it's a Jewish context. And so the first seal that is released is the rider on the white horse, and that is the Antichrist. And he will come as a false Messiah. He will present himself as a false Messiah and Savior of Israel. And in fact, he's going to sign a treaty with Israel, because they're going to accept him as a leader, and they will sign a 7-year treaty with him, and ultimately he's going to betray them on that. So what Jesus mentions here in verses 15 through 20 is what is known as the abomination of desolation. So it says in verse 15, "Therefore when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever's on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are in his house. Whoever's in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, but pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath." And so this is the abomination of desolation that was spoken of by Daniel the prophet, Jesus says. Now, we looked at this again last week, and the timing of this event is mentioned in the middle of the 70th week, where the Antichrist will break that treaty and will desecrate the temple. Now, the abomination of desolation, this is defined in Daniel and prophesied in Daniel. So Daniel chapter 11 and verse 31, in one of the prophecies that gives us more detail about the ram and goats and the things that are going to be happening in the world kingdoms. In Daniel 11:31, he speaks of a future Syrian ruler or king, and his name was Antiochus Epiphanes, and you've probably heard of him. Antiochus Epiphanes, and his action is called the abomination of desolation. And Daniel 9:27 indicates that the Antichrist, midway through the tribulation, is going to do the same thing that Antiochus Epiphanes, or the same type of thing that Antiochus Epiphanes did in that intertestamental period. Between the Old and New Testaments is when this occurred. And Daniel chapter 12 and verse 11 gives us a precise chronology, listing 1,290 days between this event, the abomination of desolation, and another event on the time period, which is the second coming of Christ. So what are the details of this event? Well, what happened historically is that Antiochus Epiphanes, he hated the Jews and he wanted everybody to worship the Greek gods, and so he actually stopped the animal sacrifices in the temple. He went in and stopped the temple sacrifices, and he offered a pig on the altar. Now, if you know anything about Jews, you know that the pigs were unclean animals. And so by offering a pig on the altar of the temple, it desecrated the altar and the temple and ruined the sacrificial system that they had, because they had a lot of regulations for cleanliness and holiness and all of those things. And so Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple by offering a pig. And the other thing that he did is he went into the Holy of Holies in the temple and set up a statue of a Greek god. And so these actions completely desecrated the temple. And it stopped the worship, and it was a really big deal. And so what we find is that the Antichrist is going to do something similar. Paul mentioned it in 2 Thessalonians 2:4. And John mentions it in Revelation 13:14 through 15. And the Antichrist is going to set up an image of himself in the temple in Jerusalem and require that all people worship him. Now, in order for this to occur, we have to understand that there must be a temple by the midpoint of the tribulation, right? So the tribulation is 7 years long. So 3.5 years in, there has to be a temple in existence, and the temple sacrifices have to be redone in order for that system to be in place. Well, do the Jews have a temple right now? No, they don't, do they? Right now they don't have a temple, and the Temple Mount is controlled primarily by the Muslims, and the Dome of the Rock is located on there. So something is going to happen. At some point, the temple is going to be rebuilt at the beginning of the tribulation period. And so what a lot of scholars, and I agree with this, what a lot of scholars think is that the 7-year peace treaty that the Jews sign with the Antichrist has a provision that allows them to rebuild their temple. Because think about it, the temple was so important to them that this will be a motivation for them to sign a peace treaty so that they have the opportunity to get their temple rebuilt. And they have everything ready right now. They've got materials ready to go, they've got plans ready to go, they've got all the sacrificial implements ready, they've got the garments for the priests, all of the things that are mentioned in the Old Testament system, they've got ready to go, and they're just waiting for a temple to be built. There is a group of Jews, and there's an organization related to the Temple Mount, and all of this is ready. They've been tracking down Jewish genealogy so they can figure out who the Levites are, so who can qualify as a priest and be able to serve in this temple. And so everything is ready to go, they just need a temple. And so I believe that the building of the temple is going to give them a motivation to sign that treaty, but then the Antichrist is going to break that treaty halfway through and desecrate that new temple. But the results of this event, then in verse 16 through 20, Jesus says, basically, get out of Dodge. When you see this happen, get out of Dodge as quick as you can. Because at that moment, the Antichrist is going to change from being Israel's protector to being Israel's persecutor. Because previously he'd signed the treaty to protect Israel, and he spends the first half of the tribulation doing that. He protects them. But then, when he sets himself up as a god and desecrates the temple with this, then they need to leave immediately, because the sooner they get out of town, the less likely they are to be persecuted and brought under the thumb of the Antichrist. And so that's why Jesus says, get out as quickly as you can. Don't even stop and pack clothes. Don't stop and get food or anything. And if you look at the prophecies of this, it's interesting that the Bible seems to indicate that they will have, that God will provide the Jews with a miraculous provision, just like he did in the wilderness. Remember, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and their clothes did not wear out, their shoes did not wear out, and God provided food and water for them. Well, that's what he's going to do here. After this takes place, the Jewish remnant is going to be miraculously preserved, and the Bible indicates that they will be in Petra. And Petra is a place that I've been there as well. And in fact, you can see a part of Petra in Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade. That place they go to in the final scenes, when they go in through that canyon, and you see the building that's carved in the rock, that's Petra. That's one of the most famous buildings at Petra. And so that's where the Bible indicates that the Jews are going to flee to, because it's a place that's easily defended and a place that's relatively safe. And so God will protect them there in that location. And so that's the abomination of desolation. And then the second half of the tribulation, the verses here in verses 21 down through 41, all of those relate to the second half of the tribulation and the end of the tribulation period. So this is known in the Bible as the Great Tribulation. So the tribulation, that refers to the entire 7-year period. But if you hear Great Tribulation, that typically refers to the last 3.5 years, because in that last 3.5 years, God's judgments are going to ramp up. The violence against believers is going to ramp up. The Antichrist is going to start actively persecuting and killing believers, and Jews especially. And so it's going to be, as Jesus describes, the greatest time of tribulation that the world has ever seen, and that the Jewish people have ever seen in all of history. Now, the Jews have suffered a lot of things over the centuries. Most recently was the Holocaust. But what's going to happen during the tribulation period is going to be nothing compared to what's happened in the Holocaust and all that previously is going to be nothing compared to what will happen during the tribulation. But ultimately what will result is that the Jewish remnant will be saved. There will be a remnant of Jews, of God's people, who will accept him as the Messiah, and they will be saved, and God's going to establish his kingdom with them. And this ties into the purpose of the tribulation. Now, we're going to be looking at the tribulation in detail in a couple of weeks. But there's a couple of different purposes for the tribulation, and just sort of as a preview, one of those purposes of the tribulation, and especially in the last 3.5 years, is to purge the unbelieving Jews and to bring the elect Jews to faith, the chosen ones to faith. So God has allowed a short time period, this 3.5 years, for the sake of the elect. Now, the passage that in verse 22, Jesus says, unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Some people like to misinterpret this passage to say something else, but what Jesus is saying there is that Satan's efforts to destroy the Jews would ultimately result in the total annihilation of all of humanity if it were allowed to reach its natural end. And so Jesus is going to intervene at the second advent in order to prevent the entire world population from being destroyed by Satan on his quest to destroy God's people. And so that's really what Jesus is talking about, is that God's going to cut that time short for the sake of those who are elect, so that they won't get destroyed in Satan's efforts. And Satan is the one behind the Antichrist and behind this whole thing to try and kill the Jews anyway. And so the final two sets of judgments, that is the trumpet and bowl judgments, correlate with the events, cosmic events that are listed in this passage here, with the sun being darkened and the moon being darkened and all of those things that are mentioned down here in verse 29 through 31 and later in verses 42 and following. So that will be in the second half of the tribulation. And then in verses 29 through 31, we have a record of the second coming or the glorious appearing. Jesus says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now, this does have some similarities to a description of the rapture, okay? And so a lot of people take this as a reference to the rapture. But actually, we'll see it's not a reference to the rapture at all. It's talking about the second coming. So there's going to be signs in the heavens. The sun and moon will be darkened, and the stars will fall from the sky. The powers of the heavens will be shaken. So there's going to be great cosmic events that are going to catch everybody's attention. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear, that is Jesus. Now, if you're looking out at something in the daytime, all right, it's hard to see some bright thing happening in the daytime because of all the ambient light, right? But at night, if there's a flash of light, it stands out very well because you've got a contrast of that light with the darkness around you. So the sign of the Son of Man is most likely talking about the Shekinah glory. Remember, the Shekinah glory is what came down and landed on the temple when it was established. The Shekinah glory is what led the people in the wilderness for 40 years. That light at night, that was like a pillar of fire, and it was a great cloud by the day. The Shekinah glory is found in other places in Scripture. And so I believe this is the sign of the Son of Man is everything is going to be darkened, and then we're going to see the Shekinah glory, and the whole world will be able to witness that. When Jesus comes, this is the sign that will appear. And the elect, and he says, will be gathered. And Jesus' second coming, again, his second coming is for the deliverance of Israel. Remember, Jesus had promised that he would come again. And when he comes, at the second coming, so the problem with these views is that they have incorrect assumptions, first of all, for the existence of Matthew 24. So these positions assume that just because the Olivet Discourse appears in the New Testament, it must automatically relate to the church. Because, and it's meant for the church because the New Testament is for the church, right? So that's their thinking. But the only justification they have for that is that it appears in the New Testament. Well, that doesn't really make sense, because there's a lot of things in the New Testament that are related to the Old, and especially in the Gospels. Everything that Jesus was doing was initially related to the Jews and presenting himself to the Jews, and it was related directly to the Old Testament. So the very fact that it's here in the New Testament doesn't mean that it's only talking about the church. But the other thing is that if you look in the Gospels, when it talks about the elect, there is no mention in the Gospels of the church being the elect. Jesus actually only mentioned the church a couple of times. And in those times, he did not use any Greek form of the word for elect, or any form of the Greek word for elect. And in fact, the first mention of the church being the elect is found by Paul in Romans 8:33. Now that was written over 20 years later. And remember, Paul was the disciple who helped establish the church and gave us an understanding of what the church is and the theology of the church. All of his epistles are written to establish the theology of the church and for the church. And Paul, to him was revealed the mystery of the church, and he talks about this elsewhere. And so the elect that are mentioned in Matthew 24 don't relate to the church. It's not talking about the church. Instead, it's talking about the Jewish believers, the remnant that are saved. And that is the consistent view through all of the Gospels. When the elect is mentioned, it's always talking about the Jews or the Jewish remnant. It's not related to the church at all. But the most important thing about this passage, Matthew 24, is the Jewish context. Remember, this was prompted by a question about the Jewish temple. The Jewish disciples were asking the Jewish Messiah about the Jewish temple and about God's plan for the Jewish people. The understanding of the disciples is demonstrated to be related to Jewish things. Even 40 days later, when he ascended, they were still asking about the kingdom. Because they still didn't understand the church. And the whole understanding of the church was revealed later through the Apostle Paul and later on through James and others. And so the entire context of Matthew 24 is Jewish. That being the case, why then would it be talking about the rapture? If it's a Jewish context, why would it be talking about the rapture? That doesn't make sense. Because the church was not in view at the time. It wasn't in view yet, because God was still presenting himself, or Jesus was still presenting himself to the Jewish people as the Messiah. And then once they rejected him, then he temporarily set them aside so that he could work with the Gentiles. And we saw that when we were studying Romans 9, 10, and 11. So this morning we've seen the Olivet Discourse. We've understood the historical and contextual details. We've seen that it's primarily a Jewish context. The church is not in view. We've looked at the disciples' questions and the misunderstanding that they had, and the things that Jesus revealed to them. And then we've determined that this passage is speaking of the second coming and not of the rapture. So even though some of the language seems very similar to a description of the rapture, next week when we look at the rapture in detail, I'm going to have a chart for you that shows differences between these. So it can't be talking about that. So we will look at some of those details next week. So do we have any comments or questions this morning?